Hi, guys, and I am so excited for this episode. We are diving into feature matching, and we have the amazing, wonderful Angela Murad from Amazing Kids AAC Consulting with us today. We want to talk about AAC feature matching and fostering ownership of our devices. Angela, how are you?
Hi, doing great.
And
I'm living here in Oklahoma. I'm ready for fall.
Yes. What do you guys have a seasonal change there? How does that work in Oklahoma?
It's very brief. We have a little bit of fall.
Just a little bit, but enough to put some fall decorations out and have some hot cocoa, I hope.
Oh, I do anyway.
Okay, good. I just dove in this fall to cold brews, and I discovered the pumpkin cream cold brew. It's quite delicious, I must say. So can you give our listeners just a little bit about your path and your background in regards to AAC? I know it's widespread and diverse.
Yeah, sure. My first experience was way back in the last rotation in grad school. So let's jump back in the time machine all the way back to 1989. Long time ago. And we didn't have a class. Well, we did. That very last semester, we had a class on AAC, but it was pretty minimal. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of options back then. And I was at a rotation at a daycare setting, childcare setting that was built specifically for inclusion of kids with special needs, called special care. And I remember having a supervisor that showed me this mid-tech device. Again, I think it was an alpha talker. Nothing earth-shattering by today's standards at all. But it was just so cool. And even if you go further back in my tech history, my dad, before retiring, was a computer guru, like programmer, analyst, and my mom, before retiring, speech language pathologist. So here I am. So I grew up building Heath kits. Do you know what a Heath kit is?
I don't. Tell me.
We built like TVs and built an alarm clock. And so I learned how to solder and all that kind of good stuff growing up. And we had computers before that was even a thing to have really in your house. So in 1989, that mid-tech device kind of hooked me of the potential. And then in my first half of my career was in early intervention. So birth to 3, going into families' homes. And towards the first 5 years of that, towards the end of that first 5 years, there was a child with CP, spastic quadriplegia, very involved, but I just knew she was in there. And in the state of Oklahoma, a child had never been approved for purchase of a high-tech device back then, under the age of, I think it may be even 4, definitely not under the age of 3. But I didn't care. There's got to be a first sometimes. And so our rep, Nuala, who's still with Toby Dynavox, by the way, and he's fabulous. I remember her bringing out the big Betamax camera, like a TV crew, because we had to supply a video. So she videoed it and we sent it in and it got approved. So that was kind of like, yeah, you can do this. It doesn't matter if no one's done it before, you can do this.
Right.
And then whenever I transferred over to a pediatric rehab hospital that's run by the state of Oklahoma, it serves from birth to 21. And so then I had lots of experience in outpatient, inpatient, teletherapy before it was even really a thing. It was on these big TVs. And a school contract. I went out to a very rural school for 8 school years.
So you really have run the gamut, and it's like you're the, it was like it was meant to be, right? I feel like it was kismet. Like
it's in my DNA. I can't not be a tech geeky SLP. I mean, what else can you do if your dad teaches you how to solder when you're little?
Right. Now, did your mom, because AAC was different back then, did your mom ever kind of get on your dad and be like, hey, I want you to build me something. I want you to help one of my clients or patients or.
She was a school speech therapist her whole career. And so that was back really kind of before AAC was a thing. I mean, I don't know if she may have used some picture symbols or something, which back in the beginning of my career, this is going to blow your younger viewers' minds, but Boardmaker wasn't invented, folks. Do you remember before pre-Boardmaker?
I don't remember it, but my co-host Cheryl Livingston, we talk about it in detail,
Yeah.
and she tells me about how she used to have to print them, and like it was a whole thing, kind of assembling
Yeah.
the books, and like
They didn't even, there was, of course, no CDs back then. So
right.
they came in this binder, they were black and white, and you had to photocopy them and cut them out. And if you wanted them colored, you got out your highlighters and matte pencils.
Yep.
You laminated with clear contact paper.
Yep. Oh, the joys. And we've just come so far, you know.
Yes.
I mean, thinking about that, you know, maybe from the Alpha Talkers, like
the little girl that I got, the Dynavox 2C was what it was. And those symbols, now that I look at pictures of it, I'm like, oh my goodness, that thing was awful. And the voice was this awful robotic voice. And so I took it home and used an external mic and literally recorded every single button on it with my voice because she needed something better than.
Yeah.
So when I hear people complain about voices, I'm like, oh, you have no idea.
Right. We've come so far. And I have to ask, I'm curious. So she was 3 at the time?
She got her device right around 3, and I actually had to apply to get a special extension to see her longer past that. Normally a child would have transitioned into public school. And then the school didn't want to allow her to bring it. So then I had to go into mama bear mode and like get her hooked up with an advocate and fight the good fight of it. I don't think so.
Okay. So do you know where she's at today? Is she?
No, unfortunately, in early intervention, we very rarely, once they transitioned out, it was pretty rare.
Sure.
Although by transferring to the hospital, we did have some patients who I actually saw way back in my EI days came through and they were like maybe 19, 20. And it was so funny. Like one young lady who I remember seeing for probably 3 or 4 years, almost her whole EI career, she had a genetic diagnosis. And she walked up and started feeling my hair. Because I have the same hair I had back then. I don't change styles. And she recognized my long blonde curly hair. And she was always kind of fascinated by wanting to touch it and everything. I'm like, oh, I remember you.
Oh my gosh, I love it. And she clearly remembered you. So the topic of today is talking about feature matching and AAC supports. So
yes.
What does that history look like for you? I mean, the supports that you currently have out are like bar none, like no one can compete with them. They're so detailed. They're so organized. They're the graphic organization, the attention to detail. It's seriously, it's bar none. Like you cannot compare it to anybody else's. So I'm curious, did that systemically come from this, the beginning of when you were kind of doing the board maker symbols and using the devices that we had back then?
I guess it was just always, no one ever really necessarily, can't remember anyone teaching me this, although I would have to say that I did attend 2 Linda Burkhart trainings very early in my career that probably greatly influenced my outlook. Like literally, I've been retired from clinical practice for 3 years, and I still cannot go into a Dollar Tree without going, oh, you can also use that for, that's not a cutting board. That could be a sentence strip.
I love some Linda Burkhart.
Yeah, so I don't know. It was just kind of my way of looking at the patients, the families, the kids. So you get to know them and you figure out what that person needs versus the flip of that I see happening a little too often is people subscribing to that there's one best way to do something. And so everyone gets that. It's like the Oprah approach. You all get the blah, 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 whatever it is. And my mind just never worked that way. It worked more, and that may come from building Heath kits with my dad too, very analytical way of looking at things. But yeah, I mean, and how I got so into the AAC apps was I just could immediately see the potential. And we had one iPad, maybe 2 at the hospital that were loaded with an AAC app, but we had a pretty large team of SLPs. And to have that many people competing to try and borrow them, to check them out, to use, I was like, oh, forget this. I'm just going to invest in my own iPad, and very quickly realized I needed a second one. So I had one for the fun stuff and one for the AAC stuff. And then I won an iPad mini in a giveaway.
Nice.
I had that. And so I just and then I just started it. No one really told you how to get access to the apps back then. So I just started contacting app developers and giving them info on how many kids we did, because it's a very big hospital as far as like kids coming in from all over the state. So it wasn't like I only did 1 or 2 AAC evals a year. That's what I did all the time. And all the app developers pretty much said, yeah, some you had to find the right person to talk to. And so that's why I ended up writing that huge blog post, the never-ending blog post about AAC, to try and help others.
And your blog is amazing. So we will definitely link that in the show notes, but your blog has tons of resources. I send at least several teams there throughout the year that are trying to get started with ideas and talking about access. We in our district, we have access. We are very blessed to have access to many devices. So we don't have that need as far as gaining access, but people are always asking outside the district, how do we gain access? How do we get what we need? And so I know in your
and I was seeing too many people ask, because this was back when Facebook kind of first got started and Facebook SLP groups first got started. And I still see it today, not as much though, but I still see and definitely saw back then people saying, give me I need free apps. I'm like, no, our kids deserve more than the free light version.
Absolutely.
That's not robust.
Right.
They deserve a robust voice.
Yes.
And that was usually the underlying issue, was that they just didn't know that there was a way to get access, and they didn't think that they could afford. And I get the tiny little school district that I worked in for 8 years through a contract, they couldn't have afforded. I mean, it was less than 300 students all on one campus from pre-K through 12. They had one student during my time there that moved in with severe autism, and it freaked them out. Totally. I had to basically make other arrangements for Medicaid for her to get what she needed, because they weren't equipped. It would have blown their whole school budget.
Yeah. And it's funny how far we've come, right? Because we're looking for something for free on a very accessible, very well-known universal tool. And we could talk probably all day just about before iPad, after iPad, before 2011, after 2011, in the sense of our devices, still our dedicated devices, they're how much? How much are they?
No, my very last device that I got funded right before retiring from clinical practice was an eye gaze device through Tobii Dynavox. I about fell out of my chair when I saw how much. But I mean, I'm not dissing them. Power wheelchairs cost that much too.
Right.
It's the similar, but I was like floored. I was like, it was way more than my car. I was like, wow.
Yeah. And what I always tell people too is that when you're looking at a dedicated system, it's not just the hardware, it's the software development, it's the support that you get through the representative, it's all of the warranty and tech support that's coming along with it. It's all of that, and it's the insurance game.
What the iPad has brought us though is it's blown it out of the water as far as how quickly we now see features added, because it used to take years. Like one device would come out and it wouldn't be that much different than the previous device. It would be years and years between when we saw really meaningful new features. And now with apps, it's amazing. I mean, when I created my feature matching chart, I thought, oh, I'll probably have to update it maybe every 2 or 3 months. Every single month there's been enough new things substantiate, not just bug fixes, but real things that I've released an update to that chart every single month.
Wow.
And so now I know why previous attempts at keeping up with feature matching type, like I used to love, I'm blanking on her name now, Jane for All.
Oh yeah.
Website. And I'm like, I know why it was too many different things to try and keep up with.
Well, I know there's been times where other people have asked you about maybe more obscure apps that aren't as well supported or known, and you do a good job of sticking to those 11 frequently used.
Well, originally it was just the 10, and then TalkSuite Pro had been relaunched long enough that I felt comfortable that it had some staying power, some sticking power. And so I went through, and it wasn't that hard to add that 11th one. The hard part was figuring out how to configure the chart for the 10, like what features to include. And I unearthed things I didn't even know about the apps. That's part of why I did it that way, because most feature matching charts are just an empty chart for you to match your own features. Well, the problem with that is, how do you know all the features if you don't have the apps and you haven't dug really deep? And I had to do lots of messaging back and forth with app developers to clarify and find out what they meant. And because like all the companies call everything different things. Like seriously, the message window, how many different names can there be for the message window? So I called it one thing in my chart. I just kind of made a unilateral decision. I'm going to call it the message window.
Yeah, versus speech display bar versus, all the.
There's too many things for it to be called. Like it was confusing. If it's confusing to me, I knew it'd be confusing to people new to AAC, and especially confusing to
text window, speech bar. Yeah, all of them.
Too many names for the same thing. It's the same thing.
So when you were kind of developing it, and when you still kind of go back and look at it, what do you hear from teams and from different people that are looking at it? What do you hear are the most important features that people are really looking to help guide their decision-making process?
Again, that really depends on the user. Because I thought, is there a way to like delete some of this and make it not be this? That's why it's on one very long PDF. Because if you go to print, I do have an alternative printable version, but it's just kind of piecemeal. It's easier. Have you looked at it on the XODO app?
I have, yes.
In and search and it's just, when I answer questions about those apps, I go back to my own chart. Because I can't remember all this stuff in my head on my own either. It's in my chart. That's how I have it organized for myself.
Yeah. And you know what I think is so interesting about the chart is that it, like you said, it brings about kind of discussions in your own head. So like, does the student have visuals, like needs that could be accommodated through a Zoom feature? Are they asking for analyzing that language data piece? Like every single component that you could possibly think of, every feature that could be within an app that's currently existing is on that chart.
Pretty much. I'm sure there's probably something I missed, but everything that I felt like I'd ever had a patient or had seen someone post about a patient or a student. For example, I guess probably the top thing I do see is when people are asking about languages. Well, I have a student who needs whatever language. If you need English, you're good. You have lots of options. The world is your oyster. You could pick any of the 11. You can look at what other features there are. If you need Spanish, that narrows it down. If you need something besides that, it gets very, very, very specific. So that's actually one of the ways I tell or coach people to narrow down what you're even looking at. If you need Vietnamese and you want voice output, you need either Cough Drop or Avaz on an Android tablet. Because even though those things can do that on an iPad, they don't have a voice. There's no Vietnamese voice on the iPad. So things like that help you narrow it down really quick.
Yeah. And I do like one of the features that you have on there is just the fact that you have other accessibility components, like can it be put on an Android? Because a lot of times that's a question, right? We might have the iPad app and it's compatible with the iPad here at school, but a family might come along and say, well, we only have Android. And how does that, or we only have a laptop at home? Like, is there something to learn it?
That's really, really easy to narrow down then. If they're on Android, then pretty much Cough Drop and Avaz on Android. If you need it on any other thing like an Amazon Fire tablet, or probably almost anything cough drop can run on. Now, they'll tell you themselves that it runs most efficiently on an Apple iPad. But there are more voice options, interestingly, on the Android platform. I'm not quite sure why, but there are more voice options.
I'm sure it goes back to Apple's very strict rhetoric on what can go on their apps.
I don't know. I keep on hoping, this is one thing I really like, if I had my techie dream, would be if they would come up with child iOS voices, then we would see a whole lot more options, because there's a lot of less expensive apps that depend on those iOS voices. And right now they're only for adult, they're only adult voices. You can tweak the pitch and rate and stuff and kind of make them fit, but not really. Like, you can make them fit a teen, but not really a young child.
Yeah, pre-COVID, I did hear, I think PRC was kind of looking into using some real child voices and adapting them. So I'm with you. I think that would be a great.
Yeah, but if Apple just did it from an iOS perspective, I mean, they released those new Siri voices. Like, if they would just release some child voices, how cool would that be?
Game changer.
Not just in AAC, but just in the other apps in general. That would just be really cool.
Yeah. Okay, listeners, you hear that? I mean, Apple, they did finally put on the eye gaze component. So I mean.
Well, we'll see though. I'm wondering what that's really gonna look like. Like, when iOS 15 rolls out, we'll know, like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean a very specific model of iPad, kind of like the head tracking?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Or does that just mean then you're going to be able to buy third-party equipment to plug into it? And how expensive will that be? Or does it mean somehow magically within just the iPad itself,
right,
you'll be able to do that? That'd be awesome.
Right.
That would be like earth-shattering big shift in the AAC world, because right now it's very expensive when someone needs eye gaze, true eye gaze. Although Cough Drop has a pretty good, have you looked at their attempts at that? It's not perfect, but Cough Drop actually has a pretty decent, and it doesn't require any special iPad. It's just on normal device.
Okay. That's going to be on the list of things to look into then, for sure. So speaking of other, supports and access and things of that regard, I know that can sometimes be a hang up. Do you feel like there's other hang-ups that you might witness when teams are trying to feature match, or what supports do you, we talked a lot about the feature matching chart that you created. Are there other supports you use, or any other hang-ups you see with teams?
I think sometimes they think the iPad can do everything. Because and this is just my personal experience, and maybe you've had different experience, and maybe other people who've had access to other switches or setups have experienced something differently. But my personal experience is, if you need switch scanning access, trying to mock that up on the iPad is very jinky. It's not reliable enough. It's very frustrating. Even if you used a wired in instead of the Bluetooth connection, it's still not the same as those SGDs that were designed with the wired in switch port that was built for that reason. So there's a reason why we still need those. An iPad doesn't magically replace the need for those other devices.
Absolutely. And I've even told the companies themselves that that's a good niche of people that they need to continue to support, because I feel like the support for our Switch users has dropped in recent years since the introduction of the iPad. I feel like they've refocused for touch users, and I feel like some of those Switch users have gotten left in the dust from their page sets not being outdated. And then I personally think the software and hardware has been glitchier in the last several years. I don't know what you've seen, but
and even on a traditional SGD. Yeah, and see, that's one area where I'm not up to date, because since I retired from clinical practice in June of 2018, I haven't seen any traditional SGDs. I don't have a reason to have my hands on those. We used to have long-term loaners at our hospital, because we did so many AAC evals. So I had a wealth of knowledge of those devices back in the day. But I mean, I'm up to date enough because I follow all of their pages and watch their webinars and all of that. Yeah, I'm geeky. I'm retired from clinical practice, but yet I still watch AAC webinars.
I'd be the same way. I would dive into it further probably than take a step back.
Well, what else am I supposed to do in a pandemic? I mean, I retired and we briefly moved to Colorado, and that didn't work out as we'd hoped. So we moved back, and then the pandemic hit. So we can't travel like we planned. And so that's actually when I had the time to develop that ridiculously detailed feature matching chart. You can thank the pandemic for that, because I probably wouldn't have ever, I mean, I had the knowledge up here, but getting it down in written format, I would have never had the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, to our benefit, then there's one more positive to COVID, I suppose. Okay. So we talked a lot about feature matching. How about, let's talk a little bit more about fostering ownership of AAC. What supports have you used in the past as far as trialing systems, and what works? What doesn't work?
As far as what works, again, I just always included, I have a resource out on my Teachers Pay Teacher store about fostering AAC ownership. Because I'd seen enough, usually whenever I do a resource, it's because I've seen enough questions come up, well, like, oh, I need something that I can then just share that with folks. But I always included AAC users as much as possible in the decisions about their own equipment. I don't know, it just seemed natural to me, or the way that my mind worked to do that. But, even if you're doing something low tech, letting them pick out the color of the binder, or letting them pick which type of symbols they want to use. I had one young lady who, 11 years old, worst velopharyngeal insufficiency I'd ever heard in my whole career. All the air coming out of her nose. It was horrible, but very verbal and very spunky and very opinionated. And every previous attempt at AAC, it would shut down a whole session. She would shove this petite little thing, you would not picture doing this, but she would shove devices off the table. It was bad. So she was my introduction into feature matching in a different way, like what a device looks like, the appearance, the strap, how heavy it is. And so she ended up with Speak for Yourself on an iPad Mini 2 in a chat wrap case with that purple boot. And I made her own carrying strap out of a Vera Bradley belt.
Of course, because you got to be stylish. And just for our listeners too, so velopharyngeal insufficiency is a vocal diagnosis that we would give as an SLP that can impact intelligibility. And so it sounds like in her case, it was significantly impacting it to the point.
Under the care, she was getting very intensive care through a speech pathologist with the cleft palate team. And she was at some point going to have further surgery. But in the meantime, no one could understand her. Intelligibility was maybe like 2%. Yeah. And when I spent enough time with her, I could get her as long as I had some context.
Sure.
So she would sit with my iPad, and I would let her look through, and she'd search online and show me what she wanted. And after one time of seeing me airdrop a picture from one iPad to the other, I'll never forget this session. I was sitting there programming and Speak for Yourself, getting it ready while she was searching, and I hear ping. I'm like, what on earth did you just airdrop a picture of Corey Monteith over to me? And then she'd point and show me where exactly on the screen she wanted it on Speak for Yourself. And the reason why that particular app was a good match for her is she didn't have any vision or fine motor issues, and it's 1 or 2 hits to get. So very quickly, she could provide that context. She could use that to supplement her verbal speech. And because she was that involved in picking the picture and where it went, she knew where everything was on that iPad. She very rarely had to use the search feature. She carried that thing cross-body with pride and showed it off to everyone. So she went from shoving AAC, they're usually in black boxes with horrible, huge black carrying straps. There was nothing dainty about them. And once she had that, she was able to tell me why she hated those other things that badly, that she told me they're ugly and that she just wanted to fit in with her friends. I'm like, okay, that should have been common sense, because any of us could go back to being 11 and think about what it's like to be 11. You want to fit in, especially girls. You want to fit in with the trendy, the cute. You don't want to stand out. And she was so dainty, there's no way she could have physically carried. Even the difference in size between a regular iPad and the mini. So one of the biggest features for her was what it looked like. And secondary was the exact, like how much that thing weighed. And thankfully, because she had such solid ownership, like she wasn't ever going to drop or throw that thing. So I didn't have to worry that the chat wrap isn't the most durable or robust protective case. It had the external speaker and it didn't weigh very much.
I love that, because so often we kind of focus on the software when we're trying to do a feature match, or we're looking at the set framework by Joe Zabala, but really the hardware can be just equally as important, and then fostering that ownership. So those operational skills.
Oh, and the other thing was the iPad was a white one. So it wasn't that even the iPad itself looked pretty.
Had that little sparkly shine to it.
Yeah, and if it hadn't started with the features of what it looked like what the whole system looked like, we would have never gotten to anything else. And if we hadn't have customized it with Corey Monteith and Zac Efron, I mean, she was big into all those shows and had crushes. Her first 2-word spontaneous utterance on Speak for Yourself was Zac Efron mine.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Nobody else getting their hands on Zac Efron. Oh my gosh, I love it.
Yeah.
So fostering ownership is a huge component of even considering a feature matching process as well.
And then I also had one young man, part of it too also was teaching them, like having it always accessible, teaching them how to carry it. And so I had one, I think he was probably maybe 16 or 17, very tall, autism. And he always carried these Mardi Gras beads, the strings like necklaces. Well, one of his sensory needs was to hold them in his hand, and he twirled them. And it was very calming, that rhythmic. So I attached a strand of those to the carrying strap on his device. He wasn't going anywhere without his beads. That was part of his, those were part of him. And so by attaching those to the carrying strap, he very quickly took ownership of, and then of course I taught him how well he could use it to request and comment and all those great things. But the first key piece was getting him to just pick it up and make sure he didn't leave it anywhere. And doing that for him meant attaching Mardi Gras beads to it.
Oh my gosh, I love it. What a good trick too. And everybody's going to know that that's his device, right?
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing, letting kids pick the strap. There's so many strap options on Amazon. I mean, you can get guitar straps and camera straps and straps with SpongeBob on them, straps with Paw Patrol. I mean, there's just so much you can do now. I remember another patient making on the lock screen, whenever the iPad screen's locked, well, whenever you tap it, there's a picture or there's like a wallpaper. Well, I would customize that and often put, this is, belongs to so-and-so, this is their voice, here's where you call if you find it. But I'd often include like Paw Patrol or, whatever they were into, Bubble Guppies.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
For my young lady that had the Vera Bradley strap, of course, her lock screen was Vera Bradley print. What else would you do to be fashionable?
Right. Oh my gosh, I love it. Anything you feel like doesn't work when you're trying to foster ownership for an AAC user?
I guess doing the polar opposite of that, just coming in and say, especially whenever you haven't done feature matching and it's a one size fits all. Everyone gets, I'm not going to name a particular, because I've seen here, it seems to happen geographically, because here it's a particular AAC app. I mean, I actually was literally at a training one time and the trainer said, I belong to the church of, well, I almost got up and walked out, but I didn't. Because there shouldn't be a church. This isn't a church. This is someone's voice.
Right.
So that whenever I've seen folks not do feature matching and just try and make a square fit into a round hole, I mean, for some kids, they might be able to do equally as well. Maybe. But I haven't really found that. Every patient that even if they were on the same AAC device or the same AAC app, I always customized it in some way.
Definitely.
So I think also if you don't take the time to add their personal core or their fringe vocabulary that's motivated to them, I've seen teams get too hung up on core vocabulary. It's not that it's not important, but there is more to communication than just core.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, where would we be without Zach Efron and Corey? I mean, like we have to have those stars in our lives, those team
Well, and
heartthrobs.
especially early on when you're trying to hook them into, why would I want to learn how to use this? Yeah, there has to be a motivation. They have to see the power. It has to be interesting to them. It can't just be, here's your device that I picked for you. That's whenever it crashes and burns. It's when you haven't done any ownership.
Or just like try to drill academic content too, right? Like you will do this, you will sit, you will answer. That's like the worst. That's the thing I see. And I'm like, ooh, they definitely see this as work. Like this is their voice. Let's flip the script a little bit.
Sometimes older users, individuals who have used it for a long time and they're motivated to use it academically, and they're wanting to multitask and know how to use their device to complete homework or those kinds of things, then sure. But to start drilling kids like on an ABA style program or something using the device, that's the fastest way to crash and burn.
So we've talked a lot about different pitfalls and things to kind of avoid. What would you say is one of those, when you think about AAC currently, what would you say is the biggest challenge right now? Is it one of the things we've already talked about, or is it something different?
I still see too many folks who are like they've drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and they're just so enamored with one particular option that they won't even open their mind to, well, what if that's not the best option for the patient that you have sitting in front of you?
Yeah.
Because and I see even people who I know really should know better comment, well, all those apps are just the same anyway. I'm like, no. Not really.
Well, I, as of recent months, I feel like there's a big push to understand Gestalt language processors more. And I feel like we're going to be completely flipped upside down in the world of AAC. And because almost all the systems are built for analytic processors, and they say up to 75% of autistic individuals are Gestalt language processors.
True. Yeah, I've been following that same info. And what's interesting, like I remember having several patients, and again, before I even knew the term Gestalt, I knew that their scripting, if you really sat and listened, and their stemming, it served a purpose. And there actually are some AAC apps that have components already. Like for example, TalkSuite Pro has a whole section of pre-recorded lines from videos and movies. And that was when I first stumbled upon that page within that app, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is for those users. Like that made me, I have no idea if that's why he developed it that way or not. But I'm like, that's for our kids who use those scripts in a purposeful way.
Well, I didn't know that TalkSuite Pro had that, so I'm going to have to kind of dive in further to that one for sure, because that's not one we regularly refer to.
That's the 11th app that I added to the chart.
Okay. See, but that's the thing is, like you said earlier, it's constantly changing. I'm like, luckily that's why I feel like I still have a job because otherwise, like you said, it would just have to pick the same thing because that's what we've always known, but it's always changing. There's always something new.
Well, and there's so many features, like there's apps that allow you to set where you can, like kids who need to touch and then like drag across the screen and then release. There's apps that allow for that. There's apps that allow you to have like a red highlight around an icon and to let you know visually it's been selected. And then as you're dragging across the screen, you can see those change in the view. I mean, there's lots of things that there are features like that folks could try and help kids be a successful direct selector without having to go to switch scanning. Like in my mind, I would try all of those possibilities because switch scanning is really hard and it's very laborious.
Right. Hard, laborious, time consuming, all of those things. It takes a lot of cognition in addition, like simultaneous cognitive and motoric abilities.
I only had in over 30 years, I had one really proficient switch scanner, and even he would get tired and just kind of go on, I'm done. It's really, eye gaze is direct selection. I mean, really, switch scanning, I did everything possible before that because that's just, it's good that it's an option, but it is very challenging for the user and for the team because there's just so much that goes into picking the right switches and the switch sites and everything about it.
So we could definitely talk probably for days about feature matching and all the different components that we need to be considering for somebody when we assess them for AAC. But for now, I will make sure that we have in the show notes the links to your Teachers Pay Teacher store so everyone can look for those resources. You also have a fantastic, we're going to highlight this as a resource later in the episode, but the pod graphic that you have where you have all the resources.
My never-ending blog post about pod. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's a great one though. Like it's just a great roundup because we do a lot of curating too, and it's just nice to have all those resources available.
That's why I purposely put it all in one spot, and that's why I have even the review of the features in the pod apps or the apps that offer pod as an in-app purchase are all right there, so you can compare.
Perfect. Okay. So, so we'll definitely highlight all those in the show notes, but I always ask everyone before you go, if you could just share with the listeners, what is your favorite AAC moment to date, whether it be with a specific individual or with yourself? What is your favorite AAC moment?
Oh, it would have to be, I had this family that I worked with over many years, but their beginning of their journey started when their son was around between 2 and 2.5. And they lived almost down at the border of Texas and Oklahoma. So they drove a long distance. He had just recently received the diagnosis of autism and was very severely affected by that. What didn't even to appear to notice that we were in the room with him. So I used a lot of strategies from the Hannon, it takes two to talk and more than words. And just forming that connection with him, like getting him. I warned his parents first. I said, I'm going to get down on the floor and I'm going to stem right along with them. And thankfully, they trusted me enough because some parents' eyes would be I don't want him to. I'm like, trust me. And this was way before people talked about doing that kind of stuff. But I'm just like, I just knew that he and I needed to form a connection before we were going to get anywhere else. So then that happened over a period of time, and then we started exploring AAC. So the very first app that I tried with him was Go Talk Now, and he showed just the tiniest glimmer of potential. I'm talking that wasn't what I had it all in my mind that we would end up with, but I was just trying options. His mom saw just that little tiny glimmer of hope, and literally the next week they showed up that she had purchased the app on her own, loaded it on his iPad, and wanted me to teach her how to program it. So we went with it. And even though it may not have been where I thought we were going, it was really a good place for them to be because that app in particular, and the reason why it's on the chart, even though it's not robust in the same ways as other apps, it has lots of fabulous features and it's extremely parent friendly. They were able to program, and she would tell me about him laying in his bed at night, tapping a button where she had programmed like their family names or his favorite foods or various TV, just whatever on there. He started verbalizing when he was all tucked up in his cozy little bed with no other people around. And that was he was basically teaching himself to talk via the Go Talk. And very quickly, once that process started happening, it's like the neurons just connected in the right way. He became totally verbal, like very rapidly. And of course, we then had to work on all kinds of other skills, but just the fact that he was able to do that, like lay in bed and practice with I felt like it was the combination of no social pressure, no other people around, and that sensory of being tucked in. And he taught himself a lot. But he went from his mom not even thinking that, she would ask me every session and be in tears. Do you think that he knows I'm his mom? Do you think he'll ever go to school? Do you think, now he just started 5th grade. When I'll even back up to like 1st grade. In 1st grade, he was teaching the seniors organic chemistry.
Wow.
He's brilliant. Brilliant.
I got so many goosebumps there.
I know, like I still think about, what if his family hadn't been willing and able to travel all the way from the Texas state line up to and they took a break in the middle of that time period, and he got there just to school, and then he started back up for kind of the latter part before I retired. But it's just amazing he and his mom and I are friends on Facebook. I don't usually do that, but I knew that we could have boundaries. But it's been amazing. The other thing that I taught him that's probably equally as important, and actually how I originally started my blog, was kids' mindfulness and yoga and affirmations. And so I taught him all those strategies to do his own self-regulation. And she would send me videos and pictures of him being at the dentist office and doing mindful breathing and coaching himself through, I can be okay and I can do this. All the way up to, I think it was maybe last summer, they were able to go to Walt Disney World, and he was okay with that sensory palooza at Walt Disney. And I could actually see in his eyes that he was happy. He wasn't just there, he was actually enjoying. And he was able to sit at school assemblies, but she also showed me he was sitting and doing his self-soothing and all the strategies that I had taught him.
That's amazing.
That was probably even more meaningful for him lifelong than anything maybe I taught him really that traditional SLP would do. But yeah, I've told his mom several times and him that he's going to invent or discover something that will save us all.
I don't doubt it.
He's brilliant. He's brilliant.
But you gave that key.
But I shudder to think if he had never gotten access to the services that he needed, had the parent support, the family support that he had, and hadn't had extremely early access to AAC, we probably wouldn't be seeing the same outcome that we're seeing right now.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Angela from Amazing Kids. It's been amazing to have you on the podcast. This has just been a joy. I've loved diving in a little deeper to feature matching. I hope everyone checks out your resources. They're fantastic. I know like you mentioned, you're very involved. Now that you have time to be involved on social media and SLP for the AAC or AAC for the SLP. So if people still have questions, is there a good contact or what's the best way to reach out?
The best way is actually private messaging on my Facebook, my Amazing Kids Facebook page. My spam is out of control on my email because I used my email with my blog for the past 10 years that I've been blogging. And so I look at that email, but I mean, there's no way I can ensure that I'll actually see. I have other emails, but I only give those out to folks like you or like app developers. I don't give my other email out to the world.
Right. So, but we'll link that in the show notes. So if anybody has follow-up questions, they can reach you there. And it's just a really great page for resources. And I know
I get questions all the time from people all over the world, and more than welcome to like help brainstorm about apps and stuff. So
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on. It's been a pleasure. Everyone, for our Innovative AAC Solutions, I'm Laura Hayes. We'll catch you next time.